Arnette, who reached the summit of Mount Everest in 2011 and is one of the world's most respected chroniclers of Everest, is in Fort Collins, Colorado. Alan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So, Alan, what do you make of the number of deaths on Everest?
You know, every death is tragic, whether it happened, 10 years ago or yesterday. But if you keep this year's numbers in context, if you look over the last, let's say, 15 years from 2000, on average, about 7 people have died every year. This year, sadly, we've had 5 deaths. So in some ways, this is a normal season.
So I guess that then raises the question, though, Alan, relatively speaking, when you're talking about Everest in comparison with other mountains, how safe is Everest?
You know, if you look at there's 14 mountains above 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet, and those are coveted by mountain climbers. Mount Everest is number 11 on that list. About 1 in 30 people who summit die trying. That's compared to Annapurna, which is another one of the 8,000 meter mountains, and 1 in 3 die on that mountain. So significantly more dangerous. That's the most deadly mountain. And if you compare the Himalayas to the mountains in the Alps, for example, the Mont Blanc range sees over 100 deaths a year. So relatively speaking, having 7 deaths a year on Everest is not as tragic as some of the other mountains around the world.
Wow, that's fascinating and important perspective. But back to Everest, Alan, what challenges and dangers do climbers face on Everest in particular?
You know, Everest is all about altitude. From a technical perspective, it's not that difficult as compared to a mountain like K2 or Nanga Parbat or some of the other even smaller mountains around the world. But altitude is all the difference. You know, it's like being in an airplane, but your feet are on the ground. And when you're climbing it, you feel like that you've got a plastic bag over your head. Even if you're using supplemental oxygen, it only makes a difference of about 3,000 feet to your body. So altitude sickness can come on unexpectedly. There's nothing you can do about it except to descend as quickly as possible. You know, Everest is a dangerous mountain.
So given that, what requirements are there to climb Mount Everest?
That's the crux of the problem. There are no requirements. There are age requirements on both sides, the Nepal side, the Tibet side, that are loosely enforced. But in terms of experience, there's been ideas floated by the Nepal government, such as having to summit a 7,000 meter mountain, but it's not enforced today. So basically, if you have the money, you can find a guide to take you on Everest.
Wow. So what is your view? I'm just curious. Do you think there need to be some kind of regulations in place to determine who can actually attempt that climb?
You know, I do. I think that there should be a requirement that you have to have climbed a 8,000 meter mountain, one of those 14 8,000 meter mountains. And in order to do that, you needed to go through the progression of like a Mount Denali or a Mont Blanc or a Mount Cook or an Aconcagua. So slowly work yourself up, get the skills, get the experience, go climb an 8,000 meter mountain before you go to Everest. When you do, then you'll know how your body performs at altitude, and you're going to know how to have the right judgment and experience rather than depending upon somebody else to take you up the mountain.
Alan, I just have one last question, something that actually someone raised in our newsroom. Are there any kind of protocols, informal protocols, about whether family members or people who are married to each other should be climbing the mountain, people with children should be climbing that mountain?
Oh, in that respect, no, there's not. In fact, I was on the mountain this year with a married couple. He had summited a few years ago, and so he and his wife wanted to go and experience together. And thankfully, they both summited and had a great time.
And then factoring into the equation children, because this person in the newsroom was raising the point, what about the dangers that are inherent there when you take on that risk and you have children who could potentially be left without their mother and father in the face of a catastrophe, possibly?
Well, without a doubt, the majority of the people that climb Everest, of the 7,000 people, only around 700 women have summited Everest. And I think the point that you're raising is the reason that more men climb Everest than women.
All right. Alan Arnette in Colorado for us. Alan, thank you so much. Appreciate your perspective.